This educational video is a public service by the Ohio Department of Higher Education, the Ohio Cyber Range Institute, and the University of Dayton Center for Cybersecurity and Data Intelligence. Learn more about this and other cybersecurity topics at the Ohio Cyber Range Institute and the University of Dayton Center for Cybersecurity and Data Intelligence.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I'm Tom Skill. I'm the Associate Provost for IT at the University of Dayton, and I'm the CIO. I'm going to give a chat today about what I call the Teaching Your Cybersecurity Team to Run with Scissors. This session is going to focus on the whole new concept of, I wouldn't call it new, it's new to IT, concept of high reliability organizations and how that model can really play into supporting what we do in IT, and in particular, what we might do in cybersecurity. So I'm going to walk through the model a bit today. I call this the Teaching Your Cybersecurity Team to Run with Scissors because essentially we're looking at the whole concept of dealing with high risk, high cost operations that really can't afford to make too many mistakes out there. And so if we're running with scissors, you know you don't want to fall on those scissors. In many cases, we think of a lot of great IT concepts around where things might have fallen apart or broken because some aspect of the way we were operating as an organization didn't quite anticipate or respond to the signals that were out there that were telling us, hey, we ought to worry about this, or we ought to worry about that. So thus the whole idea behind running with scissors. The goal of this actually is to kind of outline the fundamental practices behind high reliability organizations, but then also to kind of move this into what I call the cultural conversation. That's the kind of things that we have to do as an organization for us to be able to really respond to and really leverage the high reliability concepts. They don't happen in isolation. There's a great deal of interdependence between what we as human beings do and how we perform and what ultimately will happen with this. So here's our road ahead today. We're gonna begin with a bit of an overview of, okay, why should we be interested in this because of cybersecurity or because of IT? And I'm going to show you a few slides in a second here that will actually probably not be unfamiliar to many of you. But it sets the stage, particularly if you're looking at this concept as an organization leader and you may not have a good deal of depth around how IT might operate in your organization or how this model might feed into that. The second part of this discussion, we'll look at the 5 principles of high reliability organizations, and we'll kind of dive into those, and hopefully I'll have a few good examples of how they apply to IT. And then the third part of this is really what I think is an important component. That's the human performance side of high reliability. And there's a series of concepts there that I'm going to kind of walk through, and many of them will be familiar to you, but the context that I'm using them is what makes it a little bit different. The reason why we see this book here is because if there's any person in the field of high reliability organizations that would be considered to be the forerunner or the visionary or the father or ancestor of the whole field, it would have been Carl Weick. Carl Weick is a faculty member at the University of Michigan. He's a very well-known, world-renowned psychologist that has actually done much of his work in organizational behavior. So he's kind of married the fields of psych with the field of organizations and has really applied a lot of what many people would say are counterintuitive concepts behind the way that you might operate your business. And that's why I think his work today has been so important. But just to get us rolling here, when we think about the kind of attacks, the kind of things that threaten IT environments, these land in essentially 7 categories here. And I've pulled these from several different, you'll notice on the slides, I'm sharing the sources for this. There's a very rich reference slide at the end as well. But these 7 areas are in order of what they see as the most prominent ways that organizations that run IT systems face threats or exploits. And of course, the top of this is the fact that scanning and exploiting known vulnerabilities or in applications is a key practice now that many of the bad guys use. And this is an area where we as an organization have to be extra vigilant, and many of the HRO practices will support that. We spend an awful lot of time talking about social engineering and the phishing activities that go on. We have a group of folks here at the University of Dayton that spend a lot of time looking at this particular challenge and the best ways to respond to it. And again, there's an HRO model that speaks to that. Weak stolen credentials, malware, the persistent problem of people being granted too many permissions because it's easier to do my work if I can have all the permissions instead of just the ones I need. Those are all major pieces of exploitable attack vectors that bad guys might use in the ways that an HRO concept or model can help us defend against some of these. And so this is not going to be a tactical discussion, but it will in fact touch on many of these risks. And then of course the insider threats, and there's two kinds of insider threats. There's true bad guys who get into your systems that intend to do ill will for you. Then you have the everyday person who's in your system who does things that inadvertently make them an insider threat because they don't have enough knowledge or awareness or sophistication to know that the behaviors that they're engaging in are extremely dangerous to the security of our system. So the insider threats are a major theme for us, and that's something that we'll kind of probe as we walk through today's conversation. And then, of course, the other piece, which is a classic example of an HRO problem, if you have a system misconfigured, it does open the doors for bad guys to find those improper configurations in ways that we can potentially look to help develop a system that would prevent people from making human mistakes. Because we're not going to stop humans from being mistaken in doing many things, but we have systems and processes to help address that, and we'll see that in a few minutes. Some of the other scary stats that are out there is that Gartner reported that in this year, 2022, that we should expect to spend about $133 billion in addressing cybersecurity problems. Verizon pointed out that 34% of all data breaches involve internal actors, which means people around us are responsible for over 1/3 of the problems that we see. Those are the inadvertent insiders I just mentioned. And then, of course, we have IBM saying that now the average cost of a data breach for an organization is around $3.9 million. So that's not an inexpensive expense for us to have to shoulder if that happens. 92% of malware is now determined to have been delivered via email, which makes the phishing and the preparations for protecting against phishing a very important piece. And of course, this last one is an important one because when you see that 43% of breach victims are either small or medium-sized businesses, this kind of reflects in the fact that many small organizations don't think that they're large enough to be a target. And in reality, the bad guys out there have no idea how large you are until after they attack you, and they don't really care as long as they can get you to pay the ransom. So these are some of the factors that we deal with. Now this is a great little model that kind of shows how over the last several years the cost of entering into the field of cybersecurity has escalated greatly. You know, we've been very nervous for a long time about being the victim of an encryption ransomware attack where they come into your system, they manage to find out where all your stuff is stored, they encrypt your data, and then they try to tell you that if you don't pay them a certain amount of money in a certain amount of time, you know, that data will be forever lost to you. That's the very simple encryption stage at the single level. But now what they do, because a lot of companies and organizations have figured out how to do rapid backups and how to restore systems, and they basically tell the bad guys, sorry, we got backups, we're not going to pay you. What they do now is they steal your data so that once they're in their system, they download all that data. They then encrypt your system and they send you a message, and that message says, if you don't pay us a fee, an extortion fee for us to support your problem, we will release your data publicly, and we will continue to keep it encrypted so you won't get what you want. And then, of course, third part of that is, oh, and by the way, when we downloaded that data from your company, we also downloaded all your address books, and we're going to email all of your customers and tell them what an awful company you are because you will not pay us the fee to protect their data. And so that's the third level of extortion that they go to. And of course, the last level of extortion then is that when all else fails to say, and besides the fact, if you still don't want to pay us this, we now will attack you with a denial of service, and you won't be able to do any business anyway because your network will be completely overwhelmed with all kinds of traffic. So this is kind of like the new world of ransomware that has really made us all the more alert about how do we begin to really prepare ourselves to defend against these kinds of quadruple threats that are out there. Well, the way would propose that much of this can be addressed is by organizations, IT organizations, thinking very seriously about adopting the whole concept of becoming a high reliability organization. And this is kind of an interesting model because we've seen it. Originally it emerged by the famous Admiral Rickover, who developed the nuclear navy. And one of the interesting stats about that is that, so it started in 1955 as nuclear powered submarines, and then it's now moved to most of the aircraft carriers and other ways the Navy operates. So they've had 5,400 years of reactor operation without a single failure, which is, to me, it's just phenomenal. They've traveled 130 million miles, which is calculated, it's about 3,500 times around the Earth, and still not had an accident of any consequence. And of course, the other part is they've never had any civilian or military personnel on any of their nuclear powered ships ever exceed the federal radiation limit, which suggests that they've been operating with a pretty successful operation. Well, you don't get that way by just highly engineering solutions. The way you get that is you build an organization that leverages technology, it leverages leadership, it leverages the operational responsibility of every person involved in the activities of that ship, and it ultimately leads to some kind of a behavior change in culture that keeps you from making mistakes. And so this is where, when I think about how does cyber fit into this, we see now that this has been adopted by commercial aviation, particularly air traffic control. This has been adopted by hospitals, emergency rooms. And even to some extent, it's been adopted by some of these very high-end restaurants that have very busy kitchens with knives flying about and all kinds of stuff, and people don't end up getting hurt in those kitchens. So you can apply it at a lot of different levels. Where I have not seen a lot of conversation of late is how to apply this within the IT environment. And so the need to do that with us is because what we're really looking at is that, yes, it's important that we think about high reliability organizations as the safety culture, but what it's really about high performance. It's about the ability to function and operate under very difficult circumstances where the services that you're providing are able to be sustained because they're so critical. And to me, that pretty much describes IT today. There's not a single major industry or business out there that doesn't live and die by its IT operations. If IT goes down, you see that all of a sudden the whole operation of that business goes down. And we're seeing that now as we see the consequences of ransomware taking down many organizations. So this is how we're going to walk this today. So we'll try and show an example of how some of this operates. There's really three levels of the ways that differentiates an HRO from a typical business. And I think, first of all, mindfulness. And that's this idea that if you are a true HRO, you kind of operate, this is an awkward word, but you operate with chronic unease, okay? And we all know people in the IT operations that we serve that are always in a state of chronic unease. They're always thinking that I got to be careful because this might happen. I got to watch this. I got to do that. That chronic unease is a natural consequence of hypervigilance and watchfulness because we are really trying to be alert to any early danger signals because we don't want a small error to turn into a catastrophic error. The second part of this is responsiveness. So, HROs identify, emerging issues early on. They try to respond very quickly to arrest development because the earlier that we are able to identify issues around us, the more rapidly we have a chance of avoiding that cascading into an unrecoverable situation. And of course, as part of this is that if we're not always in some kind of a learning mode, we're not going to be effective. The organizations are not static entities that we try to maintain. We all operate within a very dynamic, high-risk world out there, and our ability to learn and understand how each event helps us inform the next future kinds of behavior we might have. So these are three of the guiding principles behind the ways that I try to frame the difference in the way we do HRO. We'll see these themes come back in different ways as we kind of go through this. And I also don't want to ignore the fact that a lot of what makes those HRO organizations effective is the fact that they're tied so closely to highly well-developed human performance activities. And we see that from all these other industries, and I mentioned these before, the naval nuclear power, the air traffic control, commercial airlines, nuclear energy generation facilities. And in fact, what's interesting is that even though there have been problems with the nuclear energy industry on land, the majority of the workers who go there in leadership roles typically have cycled out of the submarines and Navy programs on nuclear energy. So there's a lot of skill that we apply to that. Globally, the United States has done much better in managing nuclear energy issues than most other countries. And if Chernobyl being much in the news these days is an example of one that wasn't so well handled. One of the things that we find that's important is that we look here at moving out of this culture of authority to a culture of shared responsibility. And culture is really important. When I gave this talk at the Ohio Information Security Conference last spring, one of the audience members reminded me of how it's so important in the way we look at HROs that we not ignore culture, because culture drives a lot of what causes us to behave the way we do. And our behavior is really a lot of what will drive the success of a good operation like this. So this is like, and I always think about this in terms of where the Navy has been, because you think about the military as being this kind of command and control and hierarchy of authority, and we always look to the most senior person in the room to make all the calls and stuff, when in reality, when you look at a really strong HRO model, every level of that organization, every person in every operational role in that organization has a great deal of autonomy and capability to influence how that operates on a daily basis. It's not always waiting for someone to order you to do something. So this is where I think it's an important thing, is to pause for a moment. The reality is that much of what drives our thinking about an HRO model is the fact that bad things happen. And if you're in an industry where if a bad things happen, the catastrophe is very, very awful. When you think about the risk of a bad thing happening in commercial aviation, you lose an entire airplane with 300 or 400 people aboard. Those are not mistakes that you're going to learn from, okay? Those are catastrophic mistakes that you want to prevent at all costs. And one of the things that we tend to overlook is the concept of human error. The premise here is that human beings, by their very nature, are error prone. We get distracted, we forget things, we tend to overlook something, we move too fast and we forget this. All these kinds of things that are typical human error behavior are not the things that we then should step back and just blame you because you're a human being and you made a mistake. What we found, and this is a great study that the DOE, the Department of Energy, did about incidents at nuclear power plants. They found that when they looked at all the events, an event is some kind of a disruption of activity that was outside normal. When they looked at all those events, 80% of them could be attributed to human error. And so you go, oh my God, this is terrible, right? But when they did a further analysis and they said, well, let's look at what that error was that person might have committed. And they discovered that in 70% of those cases, had you had better organizational processes, that mistake would not have happened. And so that means all of a sudden you're taking this 80% of your errors down to the fact that you're something below 30% of errors being out there that are meaningful to you. And that kind of change is really important. But getting to a place where you can actually achieve this kind of organizational influence is not just a matter of somebody writing up a bunch of bureaucratic processes, because you still got to make sure that you're doing all the right things to keep human beings in the mix and to keep them alert and aware so that they are actually not making those mistakes. But part of that is, well, how can I build a process to do that? And so this is where sometimes people say, hey, the solution to that problem is that what you need to do is you need to buy another IT application. I do this every day. Everybody has some kind of issue. Oh, we need another IT application. And in many cases, an IT application could certainly help. However, the real problem there is that when they studied this, when you had simply a technology-driven solution, your problems did not go away, because in most cases, that technology solution that you brought in added just another layer of unmanaged complexity where errors and mistakes could continue to extend out there. But when you tied a technology solution with a human behavior focus, you then could essentially drop that error rate to the point where you're seeing really great productivity. And so this is where the argument is that the high reliability organization really understands that, yes, technology plays a critical role in helping solve problems, but tying that into the ways that human behavior links to that operation is significant in having a successful outcome. And so I'm arguing in favor that, hey, human beings still need to be in the model. And it strikes me again that we now have computers challenging us to prove that we're not robots. And so instead of us challenging robots to prove that they're not humans, there's an interesting shift in the way we rely on technology. So here's where we are. These 5 principles of high reliability organization, I kind of like to think of these as all characteristics of attentiveness. And the first 3 of these are kind of the anticipation components of high reliability organizations. And the latter 2 here are what I would consider to be the response to that circumstance. So there's kind of 2 dimensions to this. But the first one being, we like to focus on large and small problems or mistakes or failures. Okay. We also want to really be reluctant to accept simple explanations to problems. And this is one where this is, as I mentioned earlier on, how, what White does is counterintuitive to what many of us hear about running a good organization. We hear about, want to run a good organization? Keep it simple, stupid, right? The KISS principle. But the point here is that simplicity can many times lead you to make all kinds of false assumptions. And so you need to look at your organization at the level of complexity that it demands so that you are fully aware of all that you face. The other part that I think is really wonderful, and this is something that I have noticed in the most recent years where I've taken on a lot more operational oversight of our teams in UDIT, is that this idea of being sensitive to operations. This is the fact that at whatever level in the organization you might exist, everybody at that level needs to share in an awareness of how that organization really operates on the ground. Not how you think it operates or how you hope it operates, but you have a good sense for what are you really doing on a daily basis as an operation, and how does that in some way have an impact on the way you do things. The other thing, and this is something that we spend a lot of time on, is that we really need to create and sustain the capacity for resilience, redundancy, ways of responding, the ability to be agile and to change if circumstances change, the ability to really have the system itself is able to take a series of failures or body blows in order to survive that. I mean, our best example is that when we installed our campus network, our fiber network on campus, it's a hub and a spoke. So what we do is we have a big ring that circles the whole campus, so that if you cut it at any point, it still remains connected. And then every building is a spoke with 2 connections, so that any building on that connection, if you cut a fiber connection to that building, it remains resilient because there's a second connection there. So that kind of model is one that if we can apply that same kind of thinking to much of what we do across our operations where needed, that would certainly give us a lot more resilience. And of course, the other one, and this I think everybody who's an expert in this room, and many of you are, this is the point where respecting the expertise of those who are most knowledgeable about the situation at hand, not looking just for the boss to make the decision, is a really important step in being successful with an HRO. And we're gonna go through and probe these a bit. So let's look a little bit at why things fail. Here we have this whole idea that if we pay attention to failures, this isn't because we are miserable pessimists. It is because by understanding failure, we then learn how we can actually prevent that going forward. And that means that organizations that focus on all their failures, large and small, take them as object lessons about what can we learn about our processes, about our practices, about our training, about the way we talk with each other so that we can avoid making those mistakes. And, and many of you who know me, I've always said, I don't have any problem with people making one mistake that we've never seen before. I have a real problem if we make that same mistake again. And that's because I really want us to learn from those mistakes. Making mistakes is part of our natural consequence. And making mistakes at a small level is great because we then can hopefully prevent it from happening at a large level. So we like to focus on errors and mistakes. We also need to focus on this whole concept of near misses, and I'm going to show you a slide for that in just a second. The other thing is that, we want to really look at the ways that we can avoid being complacent. Some of us, this is one of the biggest problems you have in operations where you have things at risk, is that people who are doing it routine day in and day out, that complacency sometimes causes them to ignore or overlook the kinds of signals that should be telling them that they need to pay attention. And that means that we really don't want to let those symptoms go unaddressed. And I'm always really thrilled when someone detects a very minor symptom and is able to get in front of that right away and said, wow, we caught that before it did X, Y, Z. That's always a great story to tell, because it says that person was practicing a good example of mindfulness in the way they do their work. And so I think that finally what we want to do is one of our goals in the cybersecurity and IT space is really kind of focus on how can we develop and cultivate a strong interest in the minor cyber failures we have out there, and then use that opportunity as a way to create a stronger response program so that we don't allow those failures to grow or expand. So when I talked about the near miss thing, so, Wyke would call the near miss, the whole concept there is that it is danger in the guise of safety, okay? And that's where, people say, many people want to say, no, near miss is safety in the guise of danger. It could have been dangerous, but it wasn't. But the reality is it was very dangerous, except that we just got really lucky that time that near miss wasn't a collision. And we see a lot of those examples of in the airline industries. They talk about how many near misses they have every day, and everybody goes, oh, geez. But, in many cases, that near miss is an example of some kind of system failure. And that's where one of the things that I always like to tell people about is that every industry has its own catalog of near misses. And it is really important for us to capture those near misses in our catalog so that we can focus on those as object lessons. Understanding the kinds of possible near misses that our industry might pose us can be very beneficial to us. So that we can really kind of continue doing all these things. These small failures can really be an opportunity for us to really dive deeply into, what were the gaps and errors that happened there, or where was there the lack of visibility or available information or current information that might have helped us avoid that. What organizational process or culture or engagement should we develop so that we can better manage these processes? And of course, the other part is that, and the idea of this after action analysis, or this hot wash concept, which the military uses, is that after you've had events happen like that, it's really good to just get the team together and talk it through to figure out what might that have been. And I see that happening frequently with many of our teams across campus, but we could certainly do that a lot more. But the other thing that I really think is really important for us, for any organization, is to make sure that you capture the story, to document what that was, to have someone who can actually pull that information together and use that as part of your future educational programming and effort to reach out and develop that stronger culture. And in many cases, we have that. Kim is our storyteller for UD, and she helps us do a lot of this work. But paying attention to those kinds of stories, I tell a story about how we had a situation where we had a server that was being rebuilt, and when the engineer put the new image on that server, he inadvertently pulled the wrong image, and he put an image on that server that didn't have all the updates on it, and we immediately put that into production. It wasn't 2 hours before a cryptocurrency guy found it and began mining for cryptocurrency. It was a great mistake for us to learn from, because that mistake was small enough where it didn't hurt us, and thank God it wasn't a bad guy trying to take over our data. It was just someone who wanted some computing power. But the point there was that there are all kinds of things we could think differently about that. One is about the way we store images and how we label them. The way that once we install something, what are the protocols we might do in terms of scanning and ensuring that server has all the right updates. The other one might be whether or not we use a backup team member on anything that goes into production. There has to be a second set of eyes that checks it. All these kinds of things are ways that you could build a new process. But this is where maybe in a hot wash discussion, we would come up with that. And of course, that was a great learning lesson for our team. And I can guarantee you they will never make that mistake again. But you don't always want to train yourself on the battlefield. You'd rather kind of train yourself in the training room. So The second characteristic here is this whole idea of reluctance to simplify. And this is where we see this whole concept around us having to really develop a much more sophisticated view of what is really happening in our environments. I'm, as a CIO, I have to constantly remind myself that I can't oversimplify the really sophisticated work that many of our IT teams do, because there's a real risk there behind the way that those teams operate. And if I make assumptions about how they work, and those assumptions are simplified to that point, we could very easily have a very distorted view that will add to the complexity and the risk that's there. So maintaining a way of understanding that we are a complex business and we embrace that. At the same time, we also try to understand where can we find avenues so that complexity is not so difficult, it's inaccessible to others to understand what we do. And that's an important thing there. It's not just about trying to race to simplify, but it's more about finding better ways to share the complex nature of what we do as an organization. And this is something that, again, is counterintuitive to what Weick's contemporaries might say about that. And that's where a lot of times that when one of the things that we can make a mistake on is this whole idea of oversimplifying when we look at things like log reports that might be showing some kind of anomaly. And many times we're very quick to say, oh, that's nothing more than noise. But those folks that pay more attention to those things might say, that noise to me does not make sense. And then they dig deeper and they begin to identify that there might have been some flaw, might have been some kind of bad guy trying to make some kind of inroads into the system. So this is where I think that we are really also important in keeping in mind that what we do in IT is not just about keeping systems up, but there are very large-scale consequences to the way we function. So many times it's compliance-related. It has a cost to it. The resilience to us, organizations that are highly resilient have a much higher level of competitive advantage, because when everybody else is struggling out there, if you have the resilience to stay up and running, you're going to lead the pack, And of course, the other part that I always think about and that we really don't control in all phases, but if you have an IT failure that becomes a newsworthy event, you now begin impacting the brand and the reputation of the university, and that, of course, has some really nasty consequences. So being part of a mindset of high reliability is one that actually adds to the strategic benefit of the university, and something that we really can't ignore, even though it's not necessarily our job. Our job is to make sure that other people's job isn't to be figuring out how to explain our mistakes. And so that's one of the things I like to kind of point on. Here's the Know Your Operations, and I spent a little bit of time on this already, but the one thing there is that with looking at operations, the idea there is that we as organizations don't want to have certain kinds of assumptions about how we operate and be wrong about those assumptions and seeing that our operations fail because of that. So there's this whole concept of the failure of foresight, that because I've oversimplified what we do, what we do, we just teach. That's what we are. We're teachers. That would be such a gross simplification of what a university does. Because even now, even if you say our job is teaching, research, and service, even that is a simplification to the point, because we have this enormous kind of community outreach, and we have this whole place now where we support enterprises beyond the campus limits, and we do these global things, and we do these entrepreneurial things, and we do these investment things that are all tied to the experiential learning that students have. These kinds of things, all of a sudden now, we just spawn a much more complicated picture of what a university does. And so this is part of the importance of how do we really take a good understanding of this forward. And part of that is to kind of avoid making these kind of simple assumptions that, all universities do is they just teach a bunch of students, and they're a bunch of college students, and if they're happy in their neighborhoods, if they got beer, and that's the end of what we do. That would never fully explain the complexity here. And of course, by undervaluing that, we really miss out on being able to see the consequences of our actions. So a lot of what we look at in the operations side of cyber leadership is that we really need to spend some time thinking about culture of an organization and the values that we have around cybersecurity. And this is one of the things that is really hard to convey. We could have policies that say we need to have cybersecurity practices that are done this way, and everybody needs to do this. And the way that we encounter cybersecurity requires that people have certain kinds of passwords and certain kinds of authentication, and we restrict their privileges. We can say all those things, but if we don't have a culture that actually values that, what you will find is that people will undermine that every step of the way. And we see evidence of that from some areas, not all, not many, but some areas where they say, that rule is good for everybody else, but I'm special because the work I do is more important. Therefore, I need you to agree to give me that access or whatever that might be. I predict that that's probably an area that we will see and many organizations will see going down the road as we get into the data governance world. The idea now where we have to really bring a very disciplined approach to the way that we keep and hold and protect data, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because now we're seeing lots of government rules and regulations and consequences if you don't do it right. But I think that the courage for us to support the inconvenience of data governance is something that I kind of think about on a regular basis as I look at how many folks resist that because it may have an impact on the way I work and how easily I can do my work. So that's some of the consequences there. The fourth component here is this whole idea of resilience. And I mentioned the fact that we try to build our systems like the fiber network with a resilient infrastructure. The goal, though, is that we don't want to be a mistake-free environment. It is so difficult and so not realistic to try to develop an organization that never makes a mistake. But what you want to be is not an error-free organization, but one that when errors happen, it doesn't take you down, that you can recover from that. And a lot of that has to do with the ability of us not only to have good process in place for the way we operate, but also to have this kind of ability for our own teams to be able to be agile enough to be able to understand that if something is happening that is going to have an impact on resilience, we have a team of folks who rapidly sit down and figure out how to shift that operation or shift those functions to some other system or some other avenue so that we can recover from that. And I can tell you again, I see this on a very regular basis among our teams that think about these things, because we are always dealing with some kind of a disruption for one reason or another. And we see it more and more now with the consequence of having to work with so many third parties that, third parties, everybody at one point in time said, oh, thank God, once we can put everything out into the cloud, all the IT problems will be solved. And I can tell you, as many of you can attest, that has solved nothing. All that's done is given us more heartache and more cost and very little solution other than we have enjoyed a few more functional systems out there. But beyond that, it's not the case. So what we really want to do is that a lot of our HROs who are really thoughtful about their work, as they think about resilience, they actively sit down and they go through a what-if scenario. They think through all those possible worst case and other case kinds of scenarios. We've done these. Many of you have been part of this, where we've done tabletop exercises, where we throw a simulation out there. And the goal there is that, it's not that you're really doing it in any kind of meaningful way in terms of actually solving a direct problem. But what we're doing is we're identifying our own patterns of thinking. We're identifying opportunities for us to think differently and to change some things before the real crisis hits, because as we've worked through those mental exercises, we've realized that we have gaps, and that helps us think that through. So having a team of folks that are empowered on a regular basis to say what if and to imagine those what ifs, I think is one of the most valuable things that a team can do, because it's having those people who can think beyond today's current situation or task. So, so resilience is a commitment to imagining and planning for the worst case, but for also everything else in between. And I just kind of gave you all this gave you the same sharing here, that we see this issue, and that's particularly true if we were to take just that ransomware example of that quadruple play of ransomware attacks and thought about how would we manage through that. And of course, we just did a very similar exercise about 2 weeks ago, and many of you were part of that. So that was a good piece of that. So the last characteristic here is this whole idea of being deferential to expertise. And, in a normal organization, you have a hierarchy of leadership, and we're given good instruction on what we're to prioritize and what we're to work on a regular basis. But really, when a circumstance goes beyond normal, when you have some kind of event happen, so this is, as I call here, during abnormal events, what should we really do? Well, what we should do is we should know who it is that has the most expertise about that topic, and then we elevate them into a capacity of making decisions or at least making strong recommendations. And you can see that because when we look at this whole concept of the subject matter expert, I really like this idea of all of a sudden, what we do, the boss takes the back seat to the SME, because SMEs are the ones that kind of know what's happening. Now, the important thing there is bosses need to know who all their subject matter experts are, and they need to know how to reach them very quickly, and they need to know how to rely on a response and incident management team. And that's a lot of what we do. When we build our incident management teams, those teams are built of all our subject matter experts because we bring them around that table. And depending on what we're facing, we may do that. But one thing I think a lot of organizations have not done is that we haven't really sat down and put together we have a list of all the people in units. I'm not sure we ever sat down and said, who really knows the most about X, Y, or Z? And that would be another task for us to do. And of course, the other part too is that while we simulate certain kinds of exercises, we haven't done a broad range beyond a few of the most critical things, like a ransomware attack or some kind of a denial of service situation. But we need to probably think creatively about what are the other kinds of things that could take down an organization that may not necessarily involve some bad guy from Russia, right? So now as we move through this, I kind of argued for the concepts of HRO. But now I want to kind of move into the whole thought pattern around, okay, we've got to think about the people. And in that context, I see 5 qualities about our team, our people, that are absolutely essential in order for that organization to really be successful in developing this sustainable enterprise through various crises and problems. And so I'm going to go through each one of these separately, but as they got questioning attitude, level of knowledge, activity backup, formality. And formality is this not about everybody all of a sudden wearing tuxedos to work. This is a really different question about how we do our work in a process kind of way. And of course, the whole concept of integrity really plays in strongly here. So we'll kind of hit each of these a little bit. So the first one, questioning attitude. This is like, okay, people anticipate problems and they're alert to unusual conditions. This is a standard attribute that we would wish that everybody in every role in the IT organization brought with them on a regular basis, that they're always kind of there and they feel comfortable enough to be able to say something. And I think this is where the culture of the organization plays in so importantly. So, what you want is people thinking about what could go wrong, what's changed about this? Why is it that this doesn't seem quite right? Asking that and then kind of running those scenarios with their colleagues. But the problem that we see in a lot of cases is that sometimes people do not feel comfortable enough to even surface those issues. And that's why it's really important that we look at that. One of the things that was suggested around that is they said, fundamentally, the design of your organization that will cause some of this not to work well is that if you have two homogeneous organizations, particularly dominated by white males, which is so looking at all the white males in the room, right? I mean, that's because men have for a long time dominated the organization. And guess what? Men are known to be a lot more sloppy around taking risks than other members of the women in particular. They're not as cautious and thoughtful about it. Sometimes it's full steam ahead. So in looking at this stuff, and it's really funny to read this because here you're reading Carl Weick, this old white man, talking about the fact that the problem is me. But the reality is that it's not that you get rid of all the white guys. The challenge there is that you make sure you have a diverse team so that you're getting all those perspectives to the table so that you don't make a lot of these mistakes and you really encourage that questioning kind of thought there. So this is part of it. So you even give an example, how do we deal with this? Well, you want your stakeholders to develop that unease about their emails. And in many ways, we've done a wonderful job on this. Our people have done this. The other thing here is that when you have technical teams that engage in those what-if discussions, that provides a really wonderful stress test of our IT environments. I love it when you sit down with somebody and say, what if this happened? Or what if, and then and you get these really smart people that have thought about these systems for a long time. They're going, I can think about a way both to break that and to fix that. And these are the kinds of things that you want to bring to the table. Second thing is level of knowledge. So, this whole thing here is that, okay, people understand not only what they do, but why they do it. So this is the whole thing is that you don't just want to give people a set of instructions, say, follow these, don't ask any questions, and let me know when you're done. The real question here is that if you have people who truly understand the way that they do something and why they do it that way, you are in a much better position to anticipate and track on problems that might be out there. And of course, that's part of the thing, is that we're continually trying to expand people's understanding. That's why I just love it when we get these workshops and we get stuff going where we have a meeting downtown and people get to go to these open sessions where they're hearing a bunch of experts in different fields talk about things. The great part about that, it just keeps catalyzing in your head, like, okay, stuff I can just put in there just in case I bump into it at some future point, which is a good way to look at this. And this is where, just a good example is, okay, yeah, we love it. We get all our users to embrace strong passwords and use two-factor authentication, and they do it because they understand why that is important. They're not just doing it because someone's looking over their shoulder, The technical teams are embracing the ongoing IT education because they understand that continuing to build their skill set really allows them to add a great deal of value to the organization because the technology is changing at such a rapid pace. Keeping up is very difficult. So this is one of my favorites because this is one of the things that I've seen over the years is the hardest thing in the IT world to change is that many IT people are trained to be very autonomous, very self-sufficient, not needing to rely on a lot of people, not necessarily wanting to always trust people to mess with the stuff that they're responsible for. So there was this kind of hoarding of our systems. I used to call them the server huggers. Now that very few people have a server to hug, I'm not sure what they do, but maybe they hug their laptop. But the point there is that if you don't have this mindset that the team is there to support your success, not to be checking on you to blow you into the boss, right? If you have the sense that my team has my back and that I know that I'm going to do my best not to make a mistake, but I'm really glad that we have procedures in place where someone else is going to check my code, going to check to see whether or not my configuration was correct, going to check whether or not I did that process appropriately. Having someone having my back is a really, really important part to avoiding all the mistakes that we see that are made over the years in many operations like that. So this is, I'm part of something larger and can really celebrate that with my colleagues. So this is the application. We saw this in some of our early studies of the cybersecurity awareness training, where we saw actual people in different buildings on floors who would see a phishing message come through, who would alert their colleagues to the fact that a phishing message came through. And we immediately said that, that's the exact mindset you want. And I remember sharing that at a conference, and one of the other people there saying, no, you don't want them doing that because it'll spoil the test. And we're going, no, you're missing the point. Your job isn't to make your test hard. Your job is to make sure people don't click on the link. You misunderstood the goal of phishing by saying that we're afraid that if somebody tells somebody not to click on it, that spoils it. Well, yes, spoiling it is the best thing, and that's what we want to encourage. So the idea of the team backup is something that we got to train everybody, not just the entry-level technical teams on that stuff, but everyone else from there. And so, but that's a fun part. So we, working through this stuff and working through this whole mistrust issue is a big challenge for us. That's where we really want to develop this idea that I'm a member of a team and I'm accountable to that team, but at the same time, I feel a level of trust and comfort because my team is watching out for me. That is the best scenario in a complex IT environment that we can build out. And many of us see examples of that on a daily basis. Just figuring out how to spread that broadly and deeply is always going to be a challenge. And that's part of what we need to do when we socialize new staff who come in. And then this part here is formality. Again, this is not wearing tuxedos to work. This is the idea that, while we really see an important value in many of our procedures being well disciplined, following a process and making sure we do that, because it is the same idea that I get on an airplane and I'm always comfortable with the fact that as I see the pilots up in the cockpit with their checkboards doing this checklist that they probably have done 300,000 times in their life. And I'm thankful they keep doing that because they're human beings, and the one day I'm on that plane, they don't do that, they're going to forget to check this and they're going to crash. And so in the same sense is that if we develop formal processes, it isn't that we do formal process for every possible activity in IT, but we identify those areas where the risk is sufficient enough that creating a formal process, whether it's a checklist or a series of steps that we validate or something of that nature, that gives us the consistency that we need to reduce the likelihood of human error, because we're always going through the steps in this fashion. And that makes it, I had Janet told me a story recently that we were doing a payroll upgrade, and in the payroll office, they ran through and they out of sequence doing the steps in the payroll system that screwed up the payroll. They caught it. But the point is that had they had that checklist, because it had to be done in a specific sequence so that this payroll process did not get messed up. And therefore, it wasn't catastrophic. They learned from that. They've developed new processes from it. But in fact, it was an example of where those kinds of things do get disrupted. And so we kind of look at this. I like this idea too about how we create rules so that people feel like it's not always a favorite citizen kind of process. If you have rules and standards for how you do privileged accounts, then you don't have people screaming and yelling and saying, well, why do they get an account and I don't? We can explain here are the exact same processes. And we're actually going to make a lot of progress in this space, because when we move to our new identity and access management system, we're going to be tying everybody's access to their position. And then if you change positions, all that stuff follows you and it changes as you change position. And that will be the ideal way for us to manage those kinds of rules. So this brings us back to the point again. We will avoid, 80% of the mistakes out there. We'll be able to reduce it down to just 30%, because we will really have had a substantial change in the way we practice things. And human error is not something that we can ever avoid from happening per se, but it's something that you can certainly manage much more effectively with good process. And so the last one here is this idea of integrity. People being able to rely on people to do the right thing. In order for this whole system of being able to, for example, rely on our teams to have our back, it requires that we have what I call honest brokers at the table. Folks are coming to the table. They're saying, I'm here to do the right things. The culture of my organization is that mistakes can be made and I can own that mistake without it being catastrophic to my career, to my work life. And so when we hold ourselves and each other accountable and do that in a way that's trusting and not particularly aggressive or hostile, that's an important piece. I know that they tell a story about when von Braun was developing the early missile program down in Huntsville. They had one of the rocket blasts that went and it exploded, catastrophic destruction of the test. And one of the engineers went to him and admitted that he thinks it was a process he had done that actually caused that failure. And Wernher von Braun essentially sent this guy a bottle of champagne because had he not done that, the entire program would have to go back through a review because they would not have been able to figure out why it blew up. And this guy admitting his mistake actually did the program a failure because the program could continue going on. They just corrected the process that guy had. But there's not a lot of people who have that courage to own a mistake that big. And it's one of those things where if you have the right culture, and obviously down in Huntsville, they must have had that culture that did help them out quite substantially. So this is where I think integrity is part of it. And we have to really, part of the outcome of this is that we get people to willingly operate within the practice of what we have. We can set a lot of rules and a lot of expectations around people, but if we don't have the culture so that people join in as willing participants, we're not going to be successful. And so we need to figure out not only how to be an HRO in a meaningful way, but how to have a culture that supports all those human processes that help us do that. So just to sum it up, a lot of what HROs talk about is building higher sensitivities to those weak signals out there. Being able to see things happening at a very, very quiet stage that tells you something's not quite right. And so that means that you're alert to the deviations from expected outcomes. You really embrace this idea of focusing on those small failures that are out there. You really take a kind of a look at this saying, if things do go wrong, we have a unit, we have a team, we have an operation that really is prepared to respond vigorously to those unexpected events. And I'd say that, in many cases, that is a historic trend of what we do in IT. We always have been really good firefighters. The problem is we like to fight a few less fires and build a few more things instead. And then, of course, the other part of this is that in order to really do all those things, we have to be committed to agility, to resilience, to the teamwork piece, and always and carry with that a real sense of integrity where you own your mistakes and you take pride in the fact that you're part of a team that can trust each other. So that is my thoughts and hear those references, because in fact, all that I've shared with you today, I've stolen from a lot of other people, and these are all the people whose ideas I stole that from. And these are all great readings. I have a massive library on resilience that I would enjoy sharing with folks. So thank you, and any questions? Yeah, all right, there we go.
Can you give me an example of our SME list, or have you seen any examples of SME lists? Subject matter experts.
Oh yeah, subject matter lists. Actually, I've seen some organizations that have taken their organizational chart and they've actually added a column there, and they listed sometimes just as simple as what systems they have oversight of. But in other areas, they've also kind of listed other like oversight duties they might have. But it's just a matter of us. It wouldn't even be that hard for us to do this. It's just to kind of add a column onto our org chart, and or even our telephone list, and saying, okay, who's doing what here, And then my sense is that I look at because we have so many directors who are operationally on the ground and in many cases are most deeply knowledgeable technical people, that I looked at the directors to kind of be the first line of, okay, who knows about this? And then I see those folks immediately looking, okay, on my team, I need to talk to this person or that person. But yeah, so I'm not worried about if we have a problem not knowing who to call, because I'll just call all of you, But and I know that one you have an answer. But I think that using an org chart is one way to get at that pretty easily. Yeah. Good question.
I had a question about how to prepare our incoming employees, especially I'm thinking of people who are leaders themselves, that they tend to be older individuals. They've had a lot of experience being leaders. And younger folks are going through educational programs like here at UD, where you've got all of the new curriculum that has some cybersecurity elements embedded in it, or a whole degree, which is great. But for many people, they have none of this experience coming in. So tabletop exercises are one way to kind of get people on board. What else can be done to kind of bring people up to speed? Because it seems like this takes time.
Yeah. I think that, and this is an area I think that we need to work on, just like a lot of organizations, is that we need to put together an onboarding program for our new staff. And it has two components to it. It has a very important social component where it helps them understand our values and culture and the way we function and the way that people kind of operate under the idea that we're at a place that has a special mission. But on the other side, I think it really helps also to kind of expose them to the experts throughout the organization. So maybe you'd have, a Friday afternoon, cookies and tea or something, but you do something where on a monthly basis you did some kind of informal gathering where maybe those folks would get more exposure on that. But we have actually not done as comprehensive a job at onboarding new people as we really should. We do a pretty good job with faculty, I think. It's everybody else that kind of gets left behind. So good. Thanks, David. Okay. Intimidating but good questions. All right. Great. Well, that probably wraps it for us. So I do appreciate everybody coming today and spending an hour with me. So I hope it was somewhat helpful. So good. Thanks, folks.